Welcome back. In our previous lecture, we discussed utilitarianism. We saw how it sought to incorporate the insights of relativism and ethical egoism while attempting to correct their apparent problems. However, we saw a difficulty in utilitarianism. Utilitarianism ultimately does not answer metaethical questions. It does not provide us with a foundation for ethics. And so while the utilitarian tells us that we should act in order to maximize the greatest good for the greatest possible number of people, utilitarians do not tell us, or at least they disagree, as to what counts as good. It is with this in mind that we turn to virtue ethics. Virtue ethics, like the past theories, will try to incorporate all the previous insights while attempting to correct apparent difficulties from the past views. Here, we will focus on what virtue is, why it is appealing, some possible objections to virtue ethics, and finally, whether virtue ethics can stand against those objections. And so let's get started. First, we must ask the question, what is virtue ethics? Virtue ethics is the normative ethical view that continuous good actions form good habits, and that good habits form good character. And so, in short, virtue ethics is highly concerned with character. Well, if that is virtue ethics, then what is virtue? For the purposes of this lecture, we can think of virtue as a good habit. Its opposite is vice. Vice is a bad habit. So virtue is a good habit and vice is a bad habit. Notice already that there is something different about this ethical theory. This is the first ethical theory that we've seen that concerns itself with human character. The easiest way to understand why this is so crucial is to consider the difference between values and virtue. We value things all the time. For example, we value justice. Even an unjust person values justice, because an unjust person doesn't want unjust things done to them. So all people, even unjust people, value justice. But virtue is a little bit different. Because while one can be unjust but value justice, nobody can be unjust yet have a just character. So if we want to know whether we are good people, whether we are a good person, or whether somebody else is a good person, we should not look to our own values or to that person's values only. Under virtue ethics, we should look to the person's character, or we should look to our own character. Now, if virtue ethics is concerned with character, and good character is formed by good habits, and good habits are formed by continuous, deliberate, good actions, then we have to ask ourselves, how do we know what counts as a good act? What makes a good act good? Under virtue ethics, the answer is deceptively simple. If we want to be good people, for example, if we want to be just, then we should find and imitate just people. We should find and imitate good people. Or again, if we want to be wise, we should not just find any random person and imitate them, but rather we should find someone who is wise and follow that person. This seems pretty commonsensical. If we want to be good at something, we look to role models. These role models are people that we imitate in order to become better versions of ourselves in whatever regard. If I want to be a good soccer player, for example, I shouldn't look to just any random person, but I should look to somebody who knows how to play soccer well. Or again, if I want to be a good musician, I shouldn't just find any random person, but rather I should find somebody who is a good musician and imitate them. In the same way, if I want to be a just person, or if I want to be wise, or if I want to be a temperate person and have moderation, or if I want to be courageous, then I shouldn't just imitate random people. Rather, I should find somebody, or I should find people who are prudent, who are just, who are moderate, and who are courageous, and imitate those people. And so in short, virtue is concerned with good character. And good character is formed by good habits. And good habits are formed by good actions. And these good actions must be freely chosen. And they are freely chosen acts done through imitation of what a good role model would do. It should be noted that in virtue ethics, virtue is tied to a mean or a middle between two extremes. For example, giving money to those in need seems to be a virtuous act. It seems to be a good act. But there are two vices, two extremes that are related to it. These extremes are excess, a too much, and deficiency, a too little. The too little or deficiency of giving money to those in need is greed or hoarding. The too much or the excess is being prodigal or giving more than you are able to give, to the point where it actually damages you. And so the virtue, giving money to the poor, that's a virtuous act, but that virtuous act is between two extremes, two vices, greed and being prodigal. Or again, take the virtue of courage. Courage is a virtue that lets us stand up and face the hard things in life. But because it is a virtue, it has two extremes. The two extremes would be a deficiency and an excess. The deficiency of courage, or the lack of it, is cowardice, running away from problems that we shouldn't run away from. The excess of courage is recklessness. And so, in short, virtues are a mean between two extremes, those extremes being an excess and a defect. Both extremes are vices, they are bad habits. The mean is the target, it's the good habit. Now, there are a few noteworthy characteristics of virtue ethics that are worth stating. First, one of the things that differentiates virtue ethics from the previous ethical theories that we've looked at is that virtue ethics attempts to adopt the insights of the previous theories while attempting to avoid potential difficulties. For example, the insight we learned in relativism is that ethics has to be personal and practical. But virtue ethics is very personal and practical because it is not concerned with a mere abstract concept or idea, but rather it's concerned with concrete human character, our own individual character. Again, the insight we learn from ethical egoism is that morality must be concerned with our own individual flourishing. But virtue ethics is concerned with our own individual flourishing. It is concerned with helping us, as individual concrete human beings, to become better versions of ourselves. And finally, the insight we learn from utilitarianism, namely that there needs to be an objective component in ethics, is found in virtue ethics. The standard for what makes something just or unjust, for example, is not personal or societal opinion, but the just person himself, where by justice we just mean someone who gives people what they are owed or what they deserve. And so in short, virtue ethics seems to incorporate all the insights of the previous ethical theories into one. Second, virtue ethics answers the question, why be good? Under virtue ethics, the reason we want to be good is because we live good lives. Because if we live good lives, we will be happy. This means that happiness is not going to be different for different people. Rather, happiness has to be in some way related to virtue. In fact, the philosopher Aristotle defines happiness as an activity of the soul in accordance with perfect virtue. And this seems commonsensical in some ways. When we think of what a good car is, for example, we think of a car that functions. But not only does a good car function, it has to function well. Similarly, when we think of a good pen is one that writes well. If a pen runs out of ink, we would say that that's not a good pen, because it cannot do the thing it was meant to do. In a similar sense, this is the case with human beings and the good life. Just as we don't say that a good pen is whatever we identify a good pen to be, but rather that a good pen is one that works well, that does what it was meant to do, so too, under virtue ethics, a good human being is one that does what it's meant to do. A good human being fulfills its function, the function of what it is to be a human being. And so happiness and virtue are both related to the function of a human being. A good human being is one that does its function well, that does what a human being ought to do. And when we live in the way that we ought to live, we will be happy. It is for this reason, actually, that philosophers who subscribe to virtue ethics will say that a true education is one that orders our passions or orders our emotions. When we think about our own lives, we live using pleasure and pain. We take pleasure in some things, and we are pained by other things. But the virtue ethicist wants to ask us this particular question. Are you taking pleasure in the things that you should be taking pleasure in? And are you being pained by the things that you should be pained by? Now, typically, in our own lives, our pleasures and pains are confused quite a bit. For example, sometimes we take pleasure in things we shouldn't take pleasure in, like seeing somebody we don't like having bad fortune. Or again, a thief might take pleasure in, say, stealing. But in reality, a thief should not take pleasure in stealing. How do we know this? Well, let's think about an example for a moment. Suppose I steal your iPhone and I don't get caught. Now, under ethical egoism, if I don't get caught and stealing the iPhone benefits me, then I should definitely steal the iPhone. But virtue ethics will answer this differently. We have to ask the question, who has it worse? The person who stole the phone, the thief, or the person who got their phone stolen from? Well, let's think. The person who got their phone stolen lost a physical object, their phone. A phone is something that you could potentially replace. But the thief, in this case, also lost something. The thief lost good character. Now, what's more important, a phone or good character? Well, it seems the answer would be good character, because character is something that we live our own lives with, good character is what we live throughout our lives. If we have character, it's not something we could easily replace. It's something that lasts with us throughout our own lives. But that's not the case with, say, an iPhone. The person who got their phone stolen lost physical goods. But the thief who damaged his own character did not lose any physical goods. He lost something more important, something that cannot be easily replaced. The thief damaged and lost good character. You can always buy a new phone, but you can never buy good character. And so ultimately, the goal in virtue ethics is to align our emotions and feelings so that we take pleasure in the things that are good for us and are pained by the things that are bad for us. The last key characteristic of virtue ethics is that the virtue ethicist does not see all of morality as completely black and white, as though things are, say, either always good or always bad. They will say that maybe some things are always wrong. Like, for example, there is never a right time and a right place to, say, murder an innocent human being, or there is never a right time or a right place to commit adultery. And for that reason, acts like that would always have to be wrong. But many acts don't fall into that category. Under virtue ethics, actions are right if they are done at the right time and in the right place and for the right duration or for the right amount of time. Now, to figure out the right time and the right place and the right duration of an action requires a lot of situational awareness. There is actually a virtue that helps us consider the right time, the right place, and the right duration. And that virtue is prudence, or practical wisdom. Practical wisdom, or prudence, is the virtue that allows us to reason through changing circumstances so that we know what to do at a given time and a given place. Here, we pinpoint something quite interesting about virtue ethics. While virtue ethics is very concrete, because it is formed on the individual and on particular times, places, and circumstances, it is also abstract. It's abstract in the sense that it uses general principles or ideas to help us reason through concrete situations. In this way, virtue ethics combines the practical aspects of relativism and ethical egoism with the objective element in morality that we find in utilitarianism. But virtue ethics does not say that morality must be either concrete and individual or objective and universal. It's not an either or for the virtue ethicist. It's a both and. Morality is both concrete and individualistic, while also being universal and objective. This is seen most clearly in the virtue of prudence, because the prudent person uses reasoning to help them discern what to do in a particular situation. The virtue of prudence is like the virtue of discernment. Whenever we discern something, we may use rules or guidelines to help us, but we cannot just rely on pure abstract rules or guidelines. We also have to understand how to apply those rules and when the rule best applies, when the rule best fits. That's what the virtue ethicist does with the virtue of prudence. Through the virtue of prudence, we are able to see that actions are not always bad or always good, but that actions are sometimes good given a certain situation, and sometimes bad given a different situation. Now, despite the practicality of virtue ethics, there are a few main objections that the virtue ethicist receives. First, different cultures hold up different ideas and prize different things regarding what is good or bad, what is virtuous or vicious. For example, in some cultures, it is a vicious act to put your aging parents in a nursing home. Some cultures would say that you are being unjust to your parents, that you are not giving your parents their own due, what they deserve. But on the flip side, other cultures hold that it's perfectly fine to put aging parents in a nursing home. Under these cultures' views, it is not vicious to do that. And so we have to ask, how do we know what is actually vicious or virtuous if different cultures hold different standards? And now, of course, there is at least some merit to what the virtue ethicist is saying, insofar as even across many different cultures and many different time periods, there are ideas that we all agree are good. For example, there is no culture that holds that injustice is a virtue. Every single culture, every single society holds justice to be a virtue. Of course, they may disagree about whether a particular action is just or unjust, but overall, there is general agreement regarding justice as a virtue. And so, in short, the first objection is that while some virtues and vices may be the same for different cultures, there may be different virtues and vices for different cultures as well. The second objection is that while virtue ethics functions well as a normative ethical theory, its meta-ethical foundation seems incomplete. For example, we noted that a good person is one who fulfills their function, who acts in the way that a human being should act. But this raises a question. How should human beings act? And what is the function of the human person, the human being? The virtue ethicist will tell us that it's human nature that's the foundation. But it's not immediately clear what we mean by human nature. Or again, it's not clear whether we can know about human nature. And so the second objection is not saying that virtue ethics is wrong per se, because there are interesting insights that the virtue ethicist gives us. But that virtue ethics seems to be incomplete on its own ground. Virtue ethics needs a meta-ethical foundation in order to establish the function of the human being, so that we can actually know whether certain actions are good or not good based on that standard. The standard being the human being. And so in short, the second objection is that virtue ethics is incomplete because it lacks a meta-ethical foundation. Now, I want us to end our lecture on virtue ethics by looking at a practical piece of advice from Aristotle, the Greek philosopher who made virtue ethics popular. Aristotle acknowledges that it is difficult for us to be virtuous because virtue is a rare thing. Given that to be the case, Aristotle provides us with 2 tips for becoming more virtuous and happier as a result. The first piece of advice is this. We have to look to our own lives and consider the things that we are more easily inclined to. We should consider the things that we take pleasure in, because it is those pleasurable things that we are inclined to do. If our pleasure is not rightly ordered to virtuous action, then we should aim for the opposite of what we are inclined to. For example, if I am inclined to just sit on my couch and watch TV the whole day, I should do the opposite of what I'm inclined to do, since watching TV the whole day is not a good thing. When I do the opposite of what I'm inclined to do, and when I do that through my own free choice and do it habitually, I am able to change my habits so that I'm no longer a couch potato. And when I do that, I become more virtuous. That's the first piece of advice. The second piece of advice is this: we should be on guard regarding the things that we take pleasure in and how pleasure influences our judgments. Sometimes our own feelings and emotions can cloud our judgments, and this is also true with the things that we take pleasure in. By being more self-aware and by understanding how pleasure in our own lives influences our judgments, we would be better able to discern whether something is good or not good. Whenever we reason about anything, we should be aware of our own biases. But pleasure makes us biased towards the things that we are inclined to. And so, in order to think well about things, we should not necessarily disregard pleasure, but we should be more aware of the things we take pleasure in, so that we can better understand whether we're doing an action only because it feels good for us, or whether we're doing an action because that action is actually good. This doesn't mean that we should not take pleasure in things, but rather that we should take pleasure in the right things. And that's the goal of virtue ethics. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you.